gravitated to it. And even during the war, Union camps were places where Fenian Brotherhood recruiters would go, and they would sign men up to become members of the organization. And in 1863, the Union Army actually let members of the Fenian Brotherhood leave the front lines to travel to Chicago for the group's first convention. So it's something that it's a group that's gaining power at the time that the Civil War is going on. So the whole plan initially is to attack Ireland. That's been the idea. But after the Civil War, you start having some of the Civil War vets start to travel back to Ireland to implement this plan. The British catch wind of it and arrest the ringleaders. They suspend habeas corpus. Some of the leaders of the Irish Republican Brotherhood are forced to be on the run. So the plan to attack Ireland is one that had to be put on hold or might die completely. So there's this groundswell inside the Fenian Brotherhood to look for another plan. And some of them have always questioned the logistics of sort of doing this amphibious invasion of Ireland, and certainly the Fenian Brotherhood had no navy. So the idea is, why don't we just literally walk across the border to where the British are, and that's Canada, which at this time is a British colony. And it's a lot easier for them to strike, and they would be able to move a lot quicker than waiting around for an uprising in Ireland, which had failed generation after generation. So this group really starts to gain momentum and traction inside the Fenian Brotherhood at the end of 1865 and then into 1866. It really then becomes the ascendant wing inside the Fenian Brotherhood.
Before we get to the Fenian Raids, I'm curious about some of the Civil War experiences of members of the Fenian Brotherhood, since many of them see this as the training ground for these eventual assaults. So were there any Civil War experiences among the Fenian Brotherhood that stuck out to you in your research?
Well, it's one that's a little disconnected from, the Irish that we tend to think of, like the Irish Brigade. The members of the Fenian Brotherhood would be members of some of the militia, the state militias who were called up. What happens is, of course, that a lot of the Irish who serve in the early battles of the war end up dying in those battles. And so it's a real question of whether this is even going to be the best tactic for the Irish to take, because are all their best men going to end up dead in Antietam, Bull Run, and Fredericksburg? So it's one that there's not one particular battle that sticks out, because the ones that the Irish tended to fight in were ones in which they were, many of them ended up dead from them. There's the thread that sort of ties this book together is a man named John O'Neill. And John O'Neill was a great hunger refugee. And he came to America and ended up enlisting in the American Army and was deployed out to Utah in the years before the Civil War. He's sort of the one that he sort of, I think, epitomizes the Irish who end up in the Fenian Brotherhood through their experiences in the Civil War. And his job is to be it was to guard against Ohio and Indiana from some of the raids against the Confederates, and he had a horse that was shot out from underneath him. He moves from regiment to regiment, serves for a bit of time with the regiment of the United States Colored Troops, and then after the war he settles in Nashville, Tennessee, and then becomes smitten by this idea of attacking Canada. So the Fenians sort of just scattered in different regiments across the country. And so, like I said, any of the big battles that we know from the Irish being part of it, the unfortunate part is that many of them die and couldn't be around then for participating in the attacks on Canada. When the big attack is launched from Buffalo in 1866, you have the Louisiana Tigers, who are Irish regiment from New Orleans, or the group that travels the furthest, And you have a lot of veterans from the Massachusetts regiments as well, a lot of the Irish from the mill cities in Massachusetts who had served in the Civil War. They are notable for their service in the Fenian Raids as well.
Hey everyone, Scott here. We're going to take a very short break for a word from our sponsors.
All right, well, let's look at the master plan here that they hope will eventually secure Ireland's freedom and the plan to raid Canada. What is the plan that they put together? And I understand that the U.S. government and Andrew Johnson promises not to interfere with any of these plans. So what are these plans that they put together to raid Canada?
Yeah, this is the most fascinating aspect to me, is that this plan to attack Canada is one that at least seems to have the tacit approval of the White House. So the Fenian leaders visit the White House at the end of 1865 and have a meeting with President Johnson and Secretary of State Seward. And according to the Fenians, who are the only ones that we have records of, Johnson tells them that he will acknowledge accomplished facts on the ground and not stand in their way if they want to cross the border. And the reason for this is because of the intense animosity that grew towards the British at the end of throughout the Civil War. So, of course, we have the Trent Affair early on in the war, where the United States take a couple of Confederate diplomats off a British ship that almost leads to a war breaking out between the United States and Great Britain. British ports are used to build Confederate warships. Confederate guns are manufactured in Britain. And at the end of the war, the United States is trying to get reparations against the British for the damage caused by the Confederate warships that were built in their ports, what's called the Alabama claims. So there were these ideas that when the war was over, Senator by the name of Zach Chandler from Michigan actually had proposed that the way to heal the country was to form a 200,000-man army with 100,000 men from the south and 100,000 from the north, and they would invade Canada and try to use it to leverage the British to pay the reparations for the Alabama claims. So here comes the Fenians who want to invade Canada, and I think Johnson sort of sees it as a way to outsource the job that they were contemplating doing anyway to the Irish and let them go ahead. So that is really interesting that Johnson doesn't really stand in their way, even though the attack would be a violation of American neutrality laws. So the plan itself is put together by a general named Thomas William Sweeney, who is really the epitome of the fighting Irish. So he traveled to the United States before the Great Hunger at the age of 11, but he was swept off the deck of a ship during a storm and actually survived 30 minutes in the Atlantic Ocean before being rescued. He fought in the Mexican-American War, where he had a bullet pierce his right arm and that needed to be amputated, and he still managed with his one good arm to whip his superior officer when they had a fist fight. So he was a very experienced general, and he developed a 5-pronged plan to invade Canada. They would be launching ships from Chicago, traveling over the Great Lakes. There'd be another unit that would cross the Detroit River into Windsor, Ontario. Another force would cross the Niagara River from Buffalo. But these were all feints for the real heart of the attack, which was going to be a 17,000-man Irish army that would go up the Champlain Valley and seize Montreal, then eventually Quebec, which would choke off the lifeline to Canada, which was the St. Lawrence River. And Sweeney's a student of history. This is a plan that the Continental Army had tried in 1775, tried again in the War of 1812, but Sweeney thinks that they can succeed this time, and they also have the assumption that as soon as they cross into Quebec on their way to Montreal, that they're not only going to get the support of all the Irish in Canada, but of the French-speaking Canadians as well, who they just assume because they shared a common religion, Catholicism, and they think that the French want to cast off the British. They make the assumption that as soon as they cross into Canada, they're going to get this support. And again, this is an assumption that had been made with the Continental Army at the War of 1812, and it's one that they think is going to be different this time around.
Wow, that's really interesting. So everyone has a plan until they get punched in the face, as Mike Tyson once said. So I'm curious, how does this actually work when the plan is executed? What are their actual numbers compared to their projections? What does the initial assault look like?
It is nothing like what was planned. So instead of a 17,000-man army on its way into Montreal, the best that the Fenians were able to assemble at the border was a force of about 1,000 men in Buffalo. And the reason for this is the plan to invade Canada gets rushed because there was a split in the organization, and one faction went early in April and tried to launch an attack from Eastport, Maine to Campobello Island. That was a complete disaster. So the whole plan was rushed to try to do this invasion, which occurs at the end of May of 1866. And it has been completely infiltrated by spies from Canada, Britain, and America who all know what is going on. So there is absolutely no element of surprise in this attack. So Sweeney orders the invasion, and then he gets word very quickly that the boats that they had supposedly secured in Chicago had not shown up. Not enough men showed up in Detroit and Cleveland. He shifts everyone into Buffalo. So on the night of May 31st, 1866, they have a force of 1,000 men hidden away in the Irish neighborhoods of Buffalo, and they have weapons that have also been hidden in the city. And the decision is that that's the force that they're going to go with. So John O'Neill, who I mentioned earlier, happens to be, even though he was not very high up in any service in the Civil War, happens to be the best that they can find to lead into battle. And O'Neill has his whole life is basically pointed to this moment. He had not only seen the trauma of the Great Hunger, but he had listened to the tales that his grandfather had told of his Irish ancestors who had dared to fight against Queen Elizabeth. So he'd been raised that his whole life was going to point to his job at being the head of an Irish army fighting for Irish rights against the English, and now he's got that chance when he's basically the best that they have shown up in Buffalo that night.
1,000-person force, much less than 17,000, and they're invaded by spies all over the place. Presumably in Canada, they know the exact troop movements. So what does the beginning of this invasion look like?
There's sort of an ingenious and comical start to this. So even though the Canadians know that this is going on and that this is front page news all over the country, for some reason they don't have a defense force stationed along the border. So the border itself is undefended. There have been several false alarms in the months beforehand. So I think that basically people thought that that's what this was going to be, just another false alarm, and no one believed it was going to actually happen. So really the only defense on the border is one naval warship from the United States, USS Michigan. And when the Irish start to come out of their hiding spots and march through the streets of Buffalo, the captain of the boat, Andrew Bryson, gives the order for the ship to start to patrol the Niagara River to prevent their passage. But what Bryson doesn't know is that the Fenian Brotherhood has actually had a sleeper cell on board the vessel. There are 17 men on board who are members of the Fenian Brotherhood, and they know that there's only one way for that boat to get out in the Niagara River, and that is with the pilot of the boat, whose name is Patrick Murphy. And even though he's got a great Irish name, he is not a member of the Fenian Brotherhood. So to sabotage the boat, the Fenians actually take Patrick Murphy off the boat that night and treat him to round after round of drinks in the saloons of Buffalo, so that when they launch their attack, Patrick Murphy is not on the USS Michigan, but he is singing the Wearing of the Green on the streets of Buffalo. So Bryson cannot launch his boat, which gives the Fenians the ability to cross the Niagara River, and they do so with a couple. They had rented a couple of barges. They make a couple trips across the Niagara River. They lose a few men who decide they don't want to do the crossings.